Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Behind the Headlines, where we will be discussing President Trump's bold and abrasive plan, his push for peace in Ukraine, as he has accomplished a 90-minute phone call with President Putin, much to President Zelensky's outrage in Ukraine and indeed the concern of many across Europe. We're going to be looking at the commemoration of 3 years of this catastrophic conflict that has taken the lives of tens of thousands of individuals in Ukraine and across that Russian border as well. I'm joined as always by my good friend and co-host Simon Barrett, and we're going to be, I think, reflecting. We've been talking about this really for 4 years, haven't we?
No, absolutely. Yes, it is 4 years. Yeah. But what's extraordinary about this one is that this brutal and horrific conflict could now be coming to an end. But the question is, what does a peace agreement look like with the Ukraine and with Russia, and can we trust President Putin? I know that, for example, there's a huge amount of respect that Donald Trump has for Putin, and we know that during Joe Biden's time as US president, there wasn't a direct communications line between Moscow and Washington. There is with Trump. He's wanting to meet him in Saudi Arabia, and he's also wanting to thrash out a deal. But the question is, will this be good for the Ukraine, and will this be good for Europe, or will this empower Putin, and does this endanger the West now as effectively Putin could be rewarded for his aggression against the Ukraine?
What we're needing to see really, and what people long to see, is a just peace. But will we actually be receiving a just peace, or is there going to be, as in any conflict, will there have to be some form of concession? Will that concession be considered too great? And there's a scripture that you reminded of a few minutes ago, Simon, which I think is very important. Psalm 20 verse 7 speaks of how some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. And the reality is that in this conflict, we've seen a great deal that's been applied and supplied to Ukraine. And this conflict, we've seen ammunition, we've seen various military apparatus, there's all sorts of intelligence. Also considering the reality of potential pending conflict with Europe that could impact the United Kingdom as well. Though we're not in the EU, we are in Europe and have been quite involved in this particular conflict, particularly our involvement with NATO. We have to recognize where our hope is at in all of this. It's not in the strength of our army or the weakness of Russia's army. It's in the Lord of hosts.
No, absolutely. And I think this is very poignant, especially as the Ukrainian people themselves are having a national day of prayer and fasting on the 24th of February to actually mark the 3rd anniversary since the Russian invasion of the Ukraine that's literally turned our world upside down, and it's certainly on that geostrategic fault line. It's caused food shortages around the world. It's caused natural gas and oil shortages, and also has brought the world so much closer to a nuclear conflict. So so much is riding on this, including President Trump's presidency himself. He also wants NATO members, European NATO members, to increase their defense spending from 3% to 5%. And some are actually calling his question and his commitment to NATO, because what he's done is he's sidelined President Zelensky and he's sidelined the European allies of NATO in directly one-to-one communications with President Putin. So it's all going to see how this is all going to play out over the next coming days and weeks.
And that sidelining has seen serious questions in regard to the undermining of the sovereign integrity of Ukraine and the future of NATO as well, and its relationship pending pretty much with support from the United States. Trump has ruled Ukraine out of joining NATO, and the possibility that NATO will not give Ukraine much needed security guarantees or even future military assistance, which goes against agreements that were made all the way back in the 90s when Ukraine was given security guarantees and promises pending they're disarming their nuclear facilities. So it's understandable that President Zelensky, who is responsible under God for the security of his nation and overseeing it effectively in this particular crisis, it's understandable how he would be enraged and angered, because this has gone behind his back. It has been what seems to be a betrayal of trust. It potentially undermines Ukraine going forward. It emboldens President Putin as well in Russia, and seems to be, frankly, I think, Simon, it's looking at some sort of short-term gain, ignoring the potential for long-term loss.
Oh yeah, but I think we know very well that Trump is a businessman. He knows that this war in Ukraine is costing America and the American taxpayers billions of dollars, and he just wants to be out of it so that America can be rich and prosperous again and enrich the people of the United States. And again, this isolationist trend that we're always a bit concerned about with Trump Mark II presidency in place. Now, let's also we'll be marking also the 3rd anniversary of the Russian invasion in Ukraine that took place on the 24th of February 2022, which was the largest invasion of a sovereign European country since the Second World War, and that was over 80 plus years ago. And according to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the CSIS, the initial Russian invasion force numbered around 190,000 troops. That included militias in the Donbass region, security forces, ground combat troops believed to be in the region of 140,000. The Russian invasion in Ukraine has created the biggest refugee crisis Europe has seen since the Second World War, and around 8.1 million people have been displaced from their homes in Ukraine into Europe, according to data assembled by the UNHCR, and corresponds to around 19% of the total Ukrainian population. Roughly 18.6 million people left Ukraine, while 10.3 have decided to remain in the country. So let's just remind ourselves of that horrific invasion that took place on the 24th of February 2022. And this is thanks to our friends at CBN at the time.
As the Russians are stalled outside Ukraine's capital city, Kyiv, they're relentlessly bombarding the civilian population. Rockets, missiles, and bombs leaving significant damage. Residential neighborhoods, hospitals, and other civilians targeted. And Ukraine's leaders expect the onslaught to get worse. CBN's George Thomas is in Kyiv.
The latest reporting from the Pentagon is that the Russians have launched over 900 missiles since the start of the war. One of those missiles hitting this multi-story apartment building on the west side of Kyiv. You can still see the smoke billowing. This happened yesterday, and all the surrounding buildings as well. You can see their windows have been basically blown out, even to that building apartment over there. What you are seeing today is that because the Russians have failed over these many days to completely encircle and capture Kyiv, that they are instead going after civilian targets. The mayor of Kyiv has imposed a province-wide curfew. Nobody can go out of their homes until Thursday at 7 a.m. Why? Because the mayor fears that the next few hours are going to be probably the most dangerous hours for this city.
Ukrainian President Zelensky addressing Congress today in a virtual speech, thanking the U.S. for its help and asking for billions more in new support. With reports that Russian troops are low on morale over their lack of progress, Zelensky says Russia's demands in peace talks are sounding more realistic. But U.S. State Department officials urge caution.
We have yet to find a Russian interlocutor that is either able or willing to negotiate in good faith, and certainly not in the context of de-escalation.
Meanwhile, 3 million have fled the war in Ukraine. creating the largest refugee crisis in Europe since World War II.
It's important to consider statistics from the war, and especially in regard to the catastrophic loss of life. This is from Statista, who've reported the number of war casualties in Ukraine from the invasion until December 31st of 2024. We have published on February 4th of 2025, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights verified a total of 40,838 civilian casualties during Russia's invasion of Ukraine as of December the 31st of 2024. Of those, 28,382 people were reported to have been injured. However, the OHCHR specified that the real numbers could be higher. The highest death toll recorded was in March of 2022 at over 3,900. And of course, we saw some catastrophic scenes around that time with what was going on, particularly in Bucha, deep concerns, and had some firsthand commentary from that, as well as some of the cities there on the western side of things. But in January, Trump said that almost 1 million Russian soldiers have been killed, adding that about 700,000 Ukrainian soldiers are killed. Calculating the total number of deaths, both civilian and military, though, is complicated because Russia seldom comments on battlefield losses, with Ukraine only recently beginning to release the official information on its figures. Civilian deaths in occupied areas of Ukraine largely being unknown. And we can't forget there's vast swaths, whole cities of what has historically been Ukraine that have been taken over. You can think of places like Donetsk. These places are whole cities that have been taken over by Russia.
Yeah, and of course Odessa as well, that very important strategic point for Ukraine as well. So let's have a look at this CBN video that marks the approaching third anniversary of Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, and ask the question, where are we now?
The war has taken a heavy toll on eastern Ukraine. With cities like Kramatorsk under constant threat of attack, civilians are left to decide between escaping or enduring life in a war zone. Our team traveled to the front lines to see what these people are facing.
I want to stay in Ukraine, not in Russia. I don't know why Putin needs this, but we want to live in Ukraine.
I'm not sure what expectations others have, but what I hope for is an end to this conflict. It would be best if we didn't give away any land to them, especially since many of our relatives live there. There is already so much division.
Traveling here has become increasingly dangerous as drones dominate the battlefield. These unmanned aircraft monitor and attack, making movement risky and unpredictable. And we just saw 2 FPV drones. And so we have a jammer on our vehicle, you can see right there. But if those drones are wire guided and not wireless, we're in big trouble. Let's go.
I've been contacted by the Foreign Legion, which is the Americans who are fighting over here on the behalf of the Ukrainian government. So they contacted me to come out here and do some ministering, do some chaplaincy work with those guys.
This is how the soldiers in the field are living. These underground tunnel systems and bunkers just go for miles along the front line. And just come down here, let's take a look, and you can see how wet and cold and miserable it is down here. These positions have to be deep underground to withstand bombardment of artillery, and they spend a lot of time down here with very little to keep them warm, very little to do, just holding the line against the Russian aggression. There are still more than 4,000 members of the International Legion fighting here, and many have been here for years. We visited a group at a Bible study near the front lines, where they spoke openly about the war and how the recent U.S. election might impact Ukraine.
If Trump continues to support Ukraine, great. If he doesn't, we'll find another way. And that's basically it. We can't not. So whatever happens outside of Ukraine is their problem. and we'll deal with the cards we're dealt with on the ground.
We wait from actual help from the people of the United States, not your politics, because they can promise something on elections, but actual situation all over the world is changing every day. So we wait some support and understanding our situation. And I want to ask all people of the United States analyze the situation well to understand it.
I think on the international volunteer side, we would like to see continued support, although that's not what we expect, at least at the same level. However, a lot of people see Trump as a wild card, so to say. So things could go either way. He could completely pull out all support for Ukraine, and things will get pretty difficult for Ukraine as far as negotiating or even holding the front lines. Or, some people even hope that Trump will actually be tougher on Putin and force him, into a favorable deal down the line. Although we don't expect that this war will end within 24 hours at least. We think it's a little more complicated than that.
As winter continues, the hardships for those near the front lines intensify. Civilians and soldiers alike face freezing conditions, limited supplies, and unrelenting attacks. Despite these challenges, their hope for an acceptable peace remains.
God is our refuge and our strength, a very present help in trouble. And so while we're in here, we hear the bombs and drones exploding out there. And whenever I feel that I need to call out to God, I know when I call out to him, we serve a real and a righteous God, and he is a very present help in danger.
From Ukraine, I'm Chuck Holton for CBN News.
Excellent news report there put together by Chuck Holton of CBN. Now, the Sun newspaper had a very interesting and compelling article that does warn about the dangers of a possible peace deal that President Trump is wanting to pursue with President Putin of Russia. The title of this article is Putin's Deranged Wish List and Deadline for Trump, Talks Revealed as Delusional, Vlad Dreams of a New Soviet Empire. A furious Zelensky has warned Putin may be planning to wage war with NATO in 2026. So it says Vladimir Putin is expected to make a number of deranged demands when he finally meets Donald Trump for Ukraine peace talks in order to continue his reign of tyranny. The Russian dictator is believed to want to ensure his delusional dreams of a new and powerful Soviet empire won't be blocked by any deal with the US president. Putin illegally invaded Ukraine almost 3 years ago, with many fearing that the initial international takeover is only one step on his journey for European domination. Those who have spoken to Vlad claim his main ambition has always been to establish a new security framework that allows Russia to have a strong Soviet sphere influence in Europe. The latest president, Mr. Trump, has already spoken about the meeting with Putin after the pair shared a telephone conversation back on Wednesday, the 29th of February, for 90 minutes.
Both made it clear that they believe an end to the war is in sight, but many have concerns it will come at the expense of Ukraine. The U.S. was accused of rolling over to Russia before negotiations had even started. Over the past few days, those close to the White House have said Ukraine won't be allowed to go back to its 2014 borders before the annexing of Crimea. This would allow Moscow to keep all of the land they have stolen since invading in 2022 and make their own borders much wider. With U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth also being adamant that there is no chance Ukraine would be allowed to join NATO. Zelensky also has warned that Putin is planning to wage war with NATO in 2026 and the West needed to prepare to fight. Moscow has always maintained if Ukraine was given membership, then they would feel betrayed and react with aggression. The issue of NATO is one of the major hurdles that needs to be overcome should Moscow and Kiev come to the negotiating table soon. Many founding members of the organization have voiced their support for Ukraine's addition, with British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer saying on Friday that Ukraine is on an irreversible path to NATO. In a phone call with Zelensky, a Downing Street spokeswoman said. Putin will also be pressing for an end to banking and industrial sanctions, as well as travel curbs on Russians imposed following his illegal invasion 3 years ago.
And the article also goes on to talk about how, for example, another topic is under discussion, that of a $500 billion deal for America to access Ukraine's rare earth materials as a way of paying for Washington's continued military support. Zelensky has already warned the West against trusting in Putin amid fears that his embattled nation is being frozen out of the peace talks. He admitted playing a second fiddle to the Russian invaders was not very pleasant and urged world leaders to consider their options. NATO's head chief Mark Rutte said that it was crucial that Kiev was closely involved in any talks about the war in Ukraine after months of Putin's threats. And the US Defense Secretary has also maintained that the US is helping both nations to reach an amicable conclusion to the bloodshed. And he said earlier this week, there is no betrayal there. There's a recognition that the whole world and the United States are invested and interested in peace. That will require both sides recognizing things that they don't want to.
And the reality of this, Simon, is that we're headed very fully into this situation where we could even potentially be seeing a war of words between the U.S. and its most valued and trusted allies as well, which is not something that we want to see. This has already created a significant outrage between Zelensky and the U.S. You know, we have Trump having lengthy conversations with President Putin, while the vice president has been the one who's been sent to the table with Zelensky. And there are reasons and rationales for that, but it does seem that to some degree Ukraine has been placed second in the priority list here.
No, absolutely. But I mean, why also would you kind of reveal your negotiating hand with Putin? For example, giving in to Putin's demands that Ukraine will never be a member of NATO, and also ensuring also that there are no NATO guarantees for Ukraine's future, which makes it all possible that that Russia could invade the Ukraine again in the near future, maybe in 5 or 6 years' time. But it also means that, I mean, what happens, for example, for the war crimes that Putin has committed in the Ukraine, in the Donbass, the attack on Christian churches and Christian congregation, as well as the acts of genocide committed in Bucha. Will he get away with this? Will he then be taken out of his international isolation? Will all the sanctions that have been imposed on him then be lifted? And then he's no longer the pariah leader that he was before? Or is the West going to have the muscle and the courage to stand up to tyrants like Putin?
Well, there's a lack of perspective here. There's a lack of justice in all of this. When we talk about the Middle East, you know, we can recognize very clearly land for peace, not a good idea, never works. We go back into history and we can see the policy of appeasement that was pursued by weak leaders who sought to appease Adolf Hitler. Did that work? How did that end? And I'm not saying that we're talking about someone who is on the same scale. I think it can be a bit cliche to compare people, world leaders, to Hitler. Not saying that, but the scenario we can learn from, the scenario of history we can learn from, wherein there's this policy of appeasement. We're going to be hands off. We're going to make a deal, and it doesn't work.
Look, I think there are two big differences between kind of the Biden administration's approach to the Ukraine and the war in Ukraine against Russia and that of Trump. Firstly, it's become very clear that the Biden-Harris administration wanted regime change in Russia. So, I mean, the more that Russian forces were in the mire in the Ukraine, the more they were losing their troops, their armed forces, the more this was hurting Russia economically. And the hope then was that his regime would fall, there would be a coup taking place in Moscow, and then you're dealing with a leader who's more favorable to that of the West to bring Russia into the kind of globalist West. But of course with Trump, he's not interested in regime change at all. But there are severe warnings, particularly coming from Danish intelligence, about the prospect that Putin is planning an invasion of Eastern Europe in 2026. Do you want to read it?
Yeah, many global leaders have raised concern over Putin's potential plans, regardless of whether Moscow accepts a deal or not. Even if Russia is allowed to bully their way into positive agreements to keep Ukraine out of NATO and keep control of the land they've stolen, Putin may still not be content, as spy chiefs have warned of an acute threat from the Kremlin, saying that the tyrant is looking to start a major war within Europe within the next 5 years. Intelligence from Denmark has assessed the Russian despot's military capacity, claiming he could be ready to spark wars with neighboring regions. The unclassified assessment said that Russia perceives itself as being in conflict with the West and is preparing for a war against NATO. While no decision to initiate such a war has been made, Russia is building the capacity to make that choice if deemed necessary.
Well, it's quite a frightening scenario, and this is according to Danish intelligence that has then been passed on to our mainstream media, who have actually covered it in their news coverage. It goes on to talk about here that that Georgia and Moldova, both ex-Soviet states, are seen as potentially most at risk. Within 2 years, the report claims that Moscow could pose a significant threat to countries in the Baltic states. This could leave Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, all ex-USSRs, in line of fire of Putin's fire. So let's have a look at this report now from CBN that looks at this extraordinary report on this extraordinary telephone conversation between President Trump and President Putin that lasted 90 minutes.
Trump spent 90 minutes on the phone with Russian President Vladimir Putin, with the two leaders agreeing to start negotiations immediately to end the war between Russia and Ukraine.
I also had with President Zelensky a very good call after that. And I think we're on the way to getting peace. I think President Putin wants peace, and President Zelensky wants peace, and I want peace. I just want to see people stop getting killed.
The president said his first sit-down with Putin could be in Saudi Arabia soon, but also suggested he may go to Russia and that Putin might come to the United States.
I'll be dealing with President Putin largely on the phone, and we ultimately expect to meet. In fact, we expect that he'll come here and I'll go there and we're going to meet.
Trump indicated his second meeting will be with Ukrainian President Zelensky, who posted this photo of the phone call on X, saying no one wants peace more than Ukraine. As President Trump said, let's get it done. In a meeting with Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, Zelensky said,
I'm thankful to the president, to his message that he will support Ukraine and he really wants to stop this war. And I know that he's a strong man, and I'm sure that he will push Putin.
Trump also indicated Ukraine would have to give up territory lost to the Russian invasion.
Well, he's going to have to do what he has to do, but, you know, his poll numbers aren't particularly great, to put it mildly.
Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth at NATO headquarters also all but ruled out Russia having to return Crimea to Ukraine, which Russia invaded and annexed in 2014.
We must start by recognizing that returning to Ukraine's pre-2014 borders is an unrealistic objective. Chasing this illusionary goal will only prolong the war and cause more suffering.
This is similar to what Zelensky himself said earlier this year and at the end of last year, that it's not realistic. Ukraine doesn't have the ability to take back these territories by force. So Ukraine would be prepared to have a ceasefire and pursue the return of its territories by other means, diplomatic, political, and so forth.
NATO allies are insisting that Europe and Ukraine not be cut out of the peace negotiations. And Zelensky says he'll reject any deal that doesn't include Ukraine's input. Hegseth stressed the U.S. commitment to NATO and says the negotiations are not a betrayal of Ukrainian soldiers defending their nation. Meanwhile, in a historic move, Ukraine has established an annual National Day of Prayer. The date, February 24th, the anniversary of the Russian invasion. Dale Hurd, CBN News.
And this week's special guest, joining us all the way from Kyiv in the Ukraine, is my good friend, Pastor Dmitry. Dmitry, it's great to see you, and warm welcomes to Behind the Headlines.
Thank you. It's good to see you, my friends.
And Dmitry, do you want to describe, as we're approaching the 3rd anniversary of the brutal and aggressive invasion of the Ukraine by Russia, how you are, how your family are, and what do you think the current situation is right now in Ukraine as regards to the war?
For us, it's looked like nothing changed. Even worse, I would say. Each night, air raid alarms all night long with attacks. I mean, it's ballistic missiles, it's drones, it's all night attacks, all night air alarm. So it's for us here, it's look like not going to the end. We would like what it's coming to the end. And we hopefully waiting what President Trump maybe will help.
On that note, Dmitry, what are your thoughts concerning this abrasive and bold peace plan that President Trump has spoken about for Ukraine? It's quite controversial to some, particularly in the EU. What are your initial thoughts on it?
Actually, it's no plan as we can see so far. It's different ideas which changing rapidly and terms which rapidly changing. So we don't know which plans yet, but some ideas which President Trump was talking, surely it's not easy for us to hear. For example, if somebody say what we will not intervene in this war, we want your natural, how to say correctly,
minerals.
Your minerals, right? For money which we gave you, and it's a little bit controversial to hear, because we should remember in 1994 we gave certain nuclear weapon arsenal for guarantees, for security guarantees, and America have been right. We should remember it was the initiator, by the way, of that memorandum, Budapest memorandum. And they gave us security guarantees. And after that, someone in 20 years telling what we are not there. It's not our obligation anymore. We gave you money, and we want back your rare your minerals, because we gave you money and we want guarantee for this money. And for us, it's a little bit difficult to hear here.
And Dmitry, are you very concerned about the prospect of this 90-minute telephone conversation that President Trump had with President Putin, in which is now confirmed by the US Secretary of Defense that Ukraine will never be part of NATO, that territory taken by Russia in the Donbass region back in 2014 will remain in Russian hands, and there's no NATO security guarantee for the future of the Ukraine. Just share with us your thoughts on what many see as a betrayal by President Trump towards the Ukrainians and NATO.
I think it's too early to speak about President Trump. Is he betrayed or not? He's showman, and we know that. A lot of announcement, a lot of talking, but so far we can't see concrete deals. So I guess it's a little bit early to talk concretely. We should give him some time and to see his real deals, because now it's only talks. And it's a lot of information from Russian side, from American side, from all kinds of sides, but we don't know exactly what kind real situation. But if to speak about what we hear, and you already mentioned this, of course it's not very optimistic to us, to Ukrainians. Again, it's like if to speak like a Christians, for example, right? Somebody give you guarantees, taking from you certain nuclear biggest arsenal in the world, and it was our actually security, certain nuclear weapon arsenal. We gave for that guarantees, including what our land will be not divided, including what we will be not attacked, not by Russia, not by America, not by Britain, Great Britain, not by anyone else. We have that partners who will be defend us or giving us everything what we will need to defend ourselves. And in 20 years, somebody saying, no, it's not working anymore. We just want great deal because world tired because of this war or war in the Middle East. We need just peace, but peace for by the price of Ukrainians, peace by the price of Israelis, and how we should react, because we already lost 100,000 people. I mean, and millions of Ukrainians now, they left their homes, divided from their families, and how we should react on that. And as a Christians, I remember how God in the prophet of Joel said, I will bring the nations who will divide my land for judgment, for my judgment. Of course, we know it's speaking first of all about land of Israel, but we should remember also how God's speaking what all land is mine. And it's written in book of Acts what he gave also borders to all nations and time of visiting. So all land is his, and it's he who gave borders and lands and nations. And he said also in the book of Proverbs, everybody who will change that borders will be under curse. So it's spiritual laws, and everybody who try now to sail not by American land, not but American sovereignty, but by Ukrainians, it's I'm not sure what it will bring God's blessings also to American nations, because exactly we think it's betraying, but again we should see firstly the concrete deeds.
So there's that importance of national sovereignty. It's a God-given element of our society, of any healthy functioning society. So in relation to that, we've seen outrage over Trump's plan, and Zelensky has called for emergency meetings and the potential formation of an EU army. There's also been Danish intelligence that Putin is planning to invade Europe after 2026. What is the Ukrainian perspective on that?
President Zelensky on Munich Security Forum just a few days ago, he very clearly told, and actually I agree with him from spiritual feeling, because I'm working in Baltic states, in Belarus, Baltic states for a quite long time. So for me, I agree with President Zelensky, and he told what, according to information from Ukrainian intelligence services, what about this summer 2025, or maybe a little bit earlier, maybe a little bit further, Russia trained 15, it's about 150,000 soldiers, new one. I mean, not which one exists in the Ukrainian war already, but new one, and they wanted to bring them to Belarus. And what President Zelensky told, most probably the danger, it's not what they will be once again try to come to Ukraine and attack Kyiv once again. It probably could be, but he see what danger more in direction of Europe and Baltic states, first of all, Poland, and of course all European Union and Western Europe as well. So if to speak from my perspective, spiritual perspective, actually I agree with him. And maybe it will be even earlier than 2026 or 2027 or in 5 years, as a German Ministry of Defense told, what in 5 years probably will be war with NATO. I think it will be earlier.
So, Dmitry, we want to thank you so much for joining us on this week's Behind the Headlines. We pray for your safety and the safety and protection of your family as well.
Thank you very much, friends. We appreciate very much your support, and you don't know how much it's really valued to us. What you standing shoulder to shoulder with us, and we appreciate it very much. Thank you so much.
Well, many thanks again to Pastor Dmitry there, and you can tell and see just how much it means to this brother in Christ to know that there are friends around the world, friends in the UK, who are advocating for and praying alongside those in Ukraine. And it's so helpful to hear this perspective. Simon, I think there can be such an amount of fear that, well, maybe there's lies and there's propaganda and whatnot, and all too often people look at that from one side but aren't considering the powerful Kremlin propaganda machine. And so even among Christians, I hear a lot of perspective that seems to be advocating more for Putin's model of an understanding of this conflict rather than considering a Ukrainian believer's perspective. So that was very, very helpful.
He's a great guy, Dmitry. I've known him for a number of years, and his family are sadly in Poland while he's in Ukraine ministering and sharing the gospel. Doesn't have that much chance to go and see his family in Poland, so please keep Dmitry in our prayers. He's a great guy. Now, what's also interesting as well is that we've also had an interview that was done by John Bolton, who was President Trump's national security advisor in his previous administration. Now, he was speaking on LBC radio last week, where he made the following announcements, which was extraordinary. He said that he's concerned that President Trump has already given away several key elements of what had been core NATO and American policies. He says, I'm sure he told this directly to Putin in their 90-minute phone conversation yesterday, and they were announced by the Defense Secretary at the meeting about Ukraine and Europe, giving up the common NATO objective of restoring Ukraine's full sovereignty and territorial integrity, giving up any chance of NATO membership, basically saying there's not going to be a NATO security guarantee, calling into question the future of American existence and really the future of NATO itself.
Mr. Bolton told Tom Swarbrick, I think it's highly probable that Trump will try and withdraw the United States from NATO, and he's already setting preconditions that will justify it. You know, first he said back in his initial term, well, as these Europeans are not spending 2% of GDP on defense, which they pledged to do at the Cardiff NATO summit in 2014. Now he's saying you need to spend 5% of GDP on defense. I personally think that's what the U.S. should spend. I think in a challenging world, we're not spending enough, and we're at about 3 now. But I suspect there's almost no country in Europe, maybe the Baltics and Poland and a few others, that will go to 5%. So in a year, when it doesn't happen, Trump will be able to say, NATO is just as worthless as I always said it was, I'm getting out.
Which would be extraordinary if that happens. I mean, so far, a lot of Trump's policies he implemented are good, but I do question his method and his understanding, particularly as it involves Ukraine and pursuing a peace treaty with President Putin of Russia. In response to this, we see that Zelensky has called for a European army, and the Daily Mail reported on Saturday, the 15th of February, Under this headline, Zelensky calls for the creation of armed forces of Europe and warns Trump not to deal with Putin behind our backs over Ukraine's future. He went on to say this one, I believe the time has come to create armed forces of Europe. Money alone will not stop an enemy assault. It's not just about budgets, it's about people realizing they need to defend their own home. We need this so that decisions about Europe are made in Europe. I mean, this is extraordinary. I mean, the French President Macron has been the first European leader to call for a European army. Now Zelensky's doing this, and we can see potentially the fulfillment of biblical prophecy with this growing transatlantic rift between the United States and Europe and NATO could actually force Europe to develop and to plan building a European army, and the next step would be a United States of Europe.
Now, Trump did later assure Zelensky that he too would have a seat at the table to end the war that was sparked by Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Zelensky said Ukraine will never accept deals made behind our backs without our involvement, and the same rules should apply to all of Europe. Zelensky has insisted that 3 years of full-scale war have proven that we have already have the foundation for a united European military force. He noted the presence of NATO Security General Mark Rutte in the audience, saying his idea wasn't about replacing the alliance. This is about making Europe's contribution to our partnership equal to America's, according to the Ukrainian leader. His comments came as Foreign Secretary David Lammy urged EU nations to offer more support to Ukraine, saying the financial cost of failure would be considerably more than spending money on supporting Kiev.
And to further one step along, we see that our own Prime Minister Keir Starmer, writing in the Daily Telegraph, has actually said that he would deploy British troops to the Ukraine in any peace agreement. He says this one, writing in the Telegraph, the UK is ready to play a leading role in accelerating work on security guarantees for Ukraine. This includes further support for Ukraine's military, where the UK has already committed $3 billion a year until at least 2030. But it also means being ready and willing to contribute to security guarantees to Ukraine by putting our troops on the ground if necessary. I do not say that lightly. I feel very deeply responsible that comes with the potentially putting British servicemen and women in harm's way. But any role in helping to guarantee Ukraine's security is helping to guarantee the security of our continent and the security of this country. The end of this war, when it comes, cannot merely become a temporary pause before Putin attacks again. And do you want to comment also that when we're looking at this, how Christians, particularly evangelicals, have been deliberately targeted by Putin's forces in Ukraine?
Well, it's very important that we recognize that under Putin in Russia, there's been routine infringements on freedom of speech. There's been routine suppression of evangelical Christians. People will talk about, well, no, hold on, Christianity is flourishing in Russia. It's not. It's, you know, there's an advocation of its political wing of the Russian Orthodox Church, but anyone who is not within that remit is extremely suppressed. Across Russian-occupied Ukraine, meanwhile, Kremlin troops have shuttered places of worship since the invasion began in 2014, with religious persecution only increasing after the full-scale invasion in February of 2022. CBN has this special report on that suffering that they are experiencing.
The Russian war against Ukraine has taken a brutal toll, not just on soldiers, but on Christians who refuse to bow to Moscow's demands. Amid the devastation, a new documentary seeks to expose the truth about religious persecution in Ukraine.
The Christian role in this struggle is so critical.
We come to minister to them, to see them, to listen to them.
It's called A Faith Under Siege.
There's a lot of propaganda out there. Our thesis was you don't fight propaganda with more propaganda, you fight propaganda with truth. And the best truth is personal stories of folks that are there, that have lived this kind of stuff.
The documentary features firsthand accounts of pastors, aid workers, and believers who have been captured, tortured, or forced to flee because of their faith.
The folks that stayed in these war-torn areas to help and to minister to their folks and to others, to provide aid, were really really doing some amazing stuff. When the Russians took over and found these evangelicals, they find them very threatening.
Russian propaganda often claims to uphold traditional values, although on the ground in Ukraine, evangelicals are targeted as threats to the Kremlin's control.
Evangelical Christians especially are very loyal to our leader, Jesus. Not so much political leaders and all these other folks that occupying powers want to see loyalty to, and so that's disruptive.
CBN News traveled to Ukraine to join former Green Beret Christian Hickey, who moved his family there in 2022 as a missionary to soldiers fighting and dying on the front lines.
We want to give the food hand with a Bible and pray. So we just don't want to give food. We actually want to give Jesus, and that food gives us the access and placement to have a conversation about Jesus.
This is the kind of horror that Russia is visiting on civilians who still live in this area. And their tactics are to continue to bomb like this until everything looks like these buildings over here, and everything is destroyed, and it's not even livable anymore. And then they'll move in and set up and start bombing the next village. This is how Russia saves Ukraine. They say that they're here to save Ukraine. This is what it looks like when they save it. A faith under siege isn't just about exposing Russian war crimes. It's a call to action for Christians worldwide to pray and stand with their brothers and sisters in Ukraine.
God is our refuge and our strength, a very present help in trouble. And so while we're in here, we hear the bombs and drones exploding out there. And whenever I feel that I need to call out to God, I know when I call out to him, we serve a real and a righteous God, and he is a very present help in danger.
The film is getting exposure at the Museum of the Bible, and producers say they hope to shed light on the crisis and mobilize Christians. Our reporting on the ground matches the claims made in the film that evangelical Christians in Ukraine are facing targeted persecution at the hands of Russian forces. This is the Good News Church in Kramatorsk, and it's only about 10 miles from what is now the front lines of this war. Before the war started, they had about 700 people every week. And most of those people fled after the war started. But now they say they have a new church here because they have about 200 people every week who come that weren't members of the church before the war started, but came looking for help. And this is where they found it.
Sadly, it's the plight of Christians that are so much overlooked in this conflict, and particularly we see that Russian forces have deliberately targeted evangelical churches, particularly in the Donbas region and other regions under their occupation of the Ukraine. So this is something that we need to be praying for, and of course you've had personal experience of that. But the big question is, what is Trump after? And I generally believe that Trump has a great deal of respect for Putin, unlike, say, his predecessor Biden or Harris. And I think he believes that he can do a deal with Putin. But also, I think the key component in this is that he's not interested in regime change. So therefore, he believes that a deal can be struck. I mean, in his 90-minute conversation that he had with President Putin of Russia, he talked about the great sacrifice of Soviet troops during the Second World War and how the United States and the Soviet Union were allies in their war against the Soviets, and without Russian help, then we wouldn't have been able to defeat the Nazis. So I think this is a key component in all of this. And I think at the same time, I think he wants to end these costly wars that's costing the American taxpayer billions and billions of dollars. And he's interested in making money. He's not interested in wars.
The reality is, Simon, as with any conflict, the conclusion of this is going to call for some concessions, and there are no winners really out of it. To some degree, I believe that Ukraine may very well have to make the concession of Crimea. Do I believe that that's just? Do I believe that's right? No, not really. But in order to keep this from going into a state of perpetual war, that may very well be a concession that has to be made. In a similar way, will it work? I don't know if it will work. We've not seen it work in other places. Land for Peace sometimes has that impact.
Is there also a danger as well that this would give Putin's forces time to rebuild and repair for another possible an attack from Belarus on the Baltic states? Yes. And that this could be a time of temporary peace in order for Putin to remobilize, strengthen his army, his military forces, and then go again for another attack, particularly as we see this growing tension now between the Trump administration and NATO that is actually threatening the defense of Europe. And of course he wants European nations, and maybe this is a very clever deploy on his part to get European nations to increase their GDP spending on defense from around 3% or 2.5% to 5% of what he's asking. And America's sick and tired of underwriting European security guarantees by spending an absolute fortune on defense and the defense of Europe.
Yeah, this is also true. I think there's some rationale to all of that. He does know the art of the deal. He is a businessman, as you've already said. So what he is doing is aimed at strategizing to bring about some constructive talks, which haven't been happening. There's been no constructive conversation up to this point. So, you know, there's going to have to be concessions made at this juncture in time if we're going to be looking for an end to the war right here and right now.
Absolutely. And the big prophetic development to come out of this, isn't it? The fact that Zelensky has called for a European army. To actually come to the defense of Europe. And of course we know biblically where this would be heading, and maybe this is the conflict and the tension between Washington and Brussels that could potentially see the fulfillment of biblical prophecy with the establishment of a European army.
Yeah, and it's something that we definitely need to watch and be praying about and be aware of. All of the ins and outs of Bible prophecy can be complex and complicated in that regard, but to be watchful and aware as to where all of this could be leading and heading, recognizing that we can be in a day and time of peace when there is no peace. We're going to be at some point. But discerning the times and the seasons calls for much wisdom. So we want to thank you for tuning in to this week's edition of Behind the Headlines. Continue to pray for our brothers and sisters much beleaguered in Ukraine, under a great deal of struggle and persecution, but pressing on. Brothers and sisters like Pastor Dimitri, who we heard from earlier. And let's pray consistently that God would continue to give our leaders wisdom, that He would work everything out according to His perfect plan and sovereign purpose.